There's something happening inside Washington right now that feels less like politics and more like a system starting to push back. Not quietly, not behind closed doors, but in full public view. Because for the first time in years, the man who built his entire political identity around dominance, around winning, around control, is suddenly losing ground. Not in one place, not in one moment, but everywhere, all at once. And the most surprising part? He's not hiding it. He's reacting to it. Late on a Sunday night, when most of the country was winding down, something unusual hit social media. A long, emotional, almost unfiltered outburst. Not from an outsider, not from a critic, but from the president himself. The tone wasn't strategic. It wasn't measured. It wasn't even political. It was personal. And the primary target wasn't a foreign enemy, or a rival party, or even the media. It was the Supreme Court of the United States, a court that until recently had been one of his strongest pillars of support, a court that had protected his policies, shielded his authority, and in some cases even reshaped the limits of presidential power in ways that worked in his favor. But now that same court was being labeled something entirely different, not as a guardian of the Constitution, but as a weaponized political organization. That phrase alone sent shockwaves through Washington, because it wasn't just criticism. It was something deeper, a signal that something had shifted, not just in policy, but in perception. And when a president turns against a system that once empowered him, it raises a question that goes far beyond one ruling. What changed? To understand that, you have to zoom out, because this moment didn't happen in isolation. It's the result of multiple pressures building at the same time, from different directions, all converging into a single point. Start with the economy. Gas prices are rising again, not gradually, but sharply enough that people are noticing. And not just noticing, but reacting. Because energy prices don't stay in one lane. They ripple outward, into food costs, into transportation, into everyday life. At the same time, unemployment numbers are starting to tick upward. Not dramatically yet, but enough to create concern, enough to shift the narrative, enough to make headlines that weren't there just weeks ago. Then there's the war. A conflict that was expected to be contained is now threatening to expand. Markets are reacting. Allies are watching. And inside the United States, the public mood is shifting from curiosity to concern. Because prolonged wars don't just stay overseas. They come back in the form of cost, instability, and political consequence. And that's where things start to connect. Because while all of this is happening externally, something else is happening internally. The political coalition that once appeared solid is starting to fracture. Not collapse, not break completely, but crack. Different factions, once aligned under a single message, are now beginning to disagree, not quietly, but openly. Some are questioning strategy, others are questioning direction, and a few are questioning leadership itself. And in a movement built on unity and identity, even small fractures can grow quickly. Then there's another layer, one that hasn't gone away no matter how much attention shifts elsewhere. The investigations, the scrutiny, the constant stream of questions that refuse to disappear. And instead of fading, they're expanding, crossing borders, drawing international attention, pulling in institutions that are harder to control, harder to influence, and much harder to silence. All of this creates a kind of pressure that doesn't come from one source. It comes from everywhere. Economic pressure, political pressure, legal pressure, global pressure. And when all of those pressures hit at the same time, even the most controlled systems begin to show strain. That strain is what we saw in that Sunday night post. Because it wasn't just about the Supreme Court. It was about limits, the limits of power, the limits of control, the limits of influence. For years, the strategy had been simple: push forward, challenge boundaries, and rely on institutions to either adapt or fall in line. And for a long time, it worked. Courts ruled in his favor. Policies moved forward. Opposition struggled to keep up. But now, something is different. The same institutions that once absorbed that pressure are starting to resist it. Not completely, not uniformly, but enough to change the outcome. One ruling blocks a major policy. Another decision limits executive reach. A judge throws out a key legal effort. Individually, these moments might seem routine, but together, they form a pattern. And patterns are what matter in politics, because they signal direction. Right now, that direction is unclear. Is this a temporary setback, a moment of adjustment, or the beginning of something larger, a shift in how power is exercised, challenged, and ultimately constrained? The answer isn't obvious yet, but the reaction tells you everything you need to know. Because when frustration becomes public, when criticism becomes personal, when institutions become targets, it means something deeper is happening beneath the surface, something that goes beyond policy, something that speaks to control. And the reality is, control is no longer absolute. Not in the courts, not in the economy, not even within the coalition that once moved in lockstep. And when that kind of control starts to slip, even slightly, the response is rarely calm. It's reactive, it's emotional, and sometimes it's revealing. That Sunday night outburst wasn't just a message, it was a moment where pressure became visible, a moment where frustration turned into narrative, a moment that raised a question Washington is now quietly asking behind closed doors. If this is how things look now, what happens next? To understand why that moment exploded the way it did, you have to go back, not years, but just a few weeks. Because everything started with a decision that, on paper, looked technical, almost boring, a tariff ruling. But in reality, it was anything but. For nearly a decade, tariffs weren't just an economic tool. They were a political weapon, a strategy, a signature move that defined an entire approach to global power. Trade negotiations weren't handled quietly through diplomats and back channels anymore. They were announced, escalated, and enforced in public, often with immediate consequences. It was fast, it was aggressive, and for a long time it worked. Countries responded, markets reacted, deals were made, and more importantly, it created an image of control, of strength, of someone who could bend global systems through sheer pressure. But that entire strategy relied on one assumption, that the authority behind it would hold, that the power to impose those tariffs, unilaterally, aggressively, without delay, would remain intact. And then the court stepped in. The ruling didn't just tweak the policy. It didn't just delay implementation. It fundamentally challenged the idea that those decisions could be made without limits. Suddenly, something that had been presented as absolute was conditional. And that changes everything. Because when a strategy is built on speed and dominance, even a small delay can feel like resistance. And resistance, in this context, feels like loss. That's why this ruling hit differently. Not because it was the first legal challenge, there had been many, but because of what it represented, a boundary, a line that couldn't be crossed. And for someone who built an entire political identity around crossing lines, that's not just frustrating, it's destabilizing. Since that ruling, the pattern has been consistent. Repeated posts, repeated comments, repeated attempts to reframe the decision, not as a legal interpretation, but as something else entirely, as bias, as interference, as an attack. And that language matters, because it shifts the narrative away from policy and into something deeper, a conflict between power and oversight. But the courts aren't the only institution involved here. At the same time, another battle has been unfolding quietly, but with massive consequences. The Federal Reserve, interest rates. On the surface, it sounds technical, distant, something most people don't follow closely. But in reality, it affects everything: housing, loans, inflation, jobs. And right now, the pressure is clear. Lower the rates, stimulate growth, ease the burden. But the Federal Reserve doesn't operate on political timelines. It doesn't respond to public pressure the same way elected officials do. It moves based on data, on long-term stability, on risk. And in this case, it hasn't moved fast enough or far enough, which creates another point of friction, because now you have two major institutions, the courts and the central bank, both operating independently, both setting limits, both refusing to fully align with the direction coming from the White House. And when multiple systems start resisting at the same time, it creates a kind of bottleneck. Policies slow down, decisions get challenged, momentum stalls. That's the environment right now. And it's not happening in isolation. Because while these institutional battles are playing out, there's another front opening up, one that's far less predictable: public opinion. Polls are starting to shift, not dramatically yet, but enough to raise concern. Economic dissatisfaction is growing. Questions about the war are becoming louder. And perhaps most importantly, the messaging that once unified supporters is starting to fragment. Some voices are calling for more aggression. Others are calling for restraint. Some are fully aligned. Others are beginning to question. And in a political landscape built on strong, consistent messaging, even slight variations can create instability. That instability is what makes moments like the Sunday night outburst so significant, because they don't happen in a vacuum. They're the result of everything building up at once: the court ruling, the economic pressure, the war, the internal divisions, the legal challenges, all of it converging into a single point. And when that happens, the response isn't always strategic. Sometimes it's reactive, sometimes it's emotional, and sometimes it reveals more than intended. Because in that moment, the focus wasn't on policy details. It wasn't on explaining a strategy or outlining a plan. It was on assigning blame to the courts, to the media, to regulators, to anyone seen as standing in the way. And that's a shift, because earlier phases of this political approach were defined by control, controlling the narrative, controlling the pace, controlling the outcome. Now it feels different. Now it feels like reacting to forces that are harder to control. And that's where things become unpredictable, because when control starts to slip, even slightly, the response can go in different directions. It can become more aggressive, more confrontational, more determined to push through resistance. Or it can signal something else: a recognition that the environment has changed, that the same strategies that worked before may not work the same way now. But here's the critical part. That recognition hasn't fully happened yet. Instead, what we're seeing is a doubling down, a continued push against institutions, a continued framing of resistance as opposition. And that sets up the next phase of this story. Because when pressure builds and resistance increases, something has to give. Either the system adapts or the conflict escalates. And right now, it's not clear which direction this is heading. But one thing is certain: this is no longer just about one ruling, or one policy, or one moment. This is about a broader shift in how power is being challenged, and how that challenge is being answered. And the next developments, they won't come quietly. They'll come in decisions, in reactions, in moments that feel small on the surface, but carry much bigger consequences underneath. Because when multiple systems start pushing back at once, the real question isn't who wins the next battle. It's who controls the direction of everything that comes after. Now the situation begins to move into even more dangerous territory, because what started as pressure is slowly turning into confrontation, not on a battlefield, but inside the system itself. Because when a leader begins to openly challenge institutions that are designed to limit power, the conflict stops being about policy and starts becoming about authority. And that's exactly what's happening now. The language has changed. It's no longer just disagreement, it's accusation. Judges are no longer just interpreting the law, they're being described as biased, corrupt, even out of control. The Supreme Court is no longer just issuing rulings, it's being portrayed as a political weapon. And when that kind of narrative takes hold, it does something very specific. It reframes the entire system. Instead of checks and balances, it becomes obstruction. Instead of independence, it becomes opposition. And once that shift happens, every decision, every ruling, every delay starts to feel like a deliberate attack rather than a legal process. That perception is powerful, because perception shapes reaction, and the reaction we're seeing is intensifying. Take what happened with the federal judge who blocked one of the administration's major legal efforts. The response wasn't just disagreement, it was personal. A list of insults, public condemnation, calls for consequences. That's not typical political pushback, that's escalation. And escalation always carries risk, because once institutions become targets, the next step is pressure, public pressure, political pressure, and sometimes attempts to reshape those institutions entirely. But here's where it gets complicated, because these institutions, courts, regulators, central banks, are designed to resist pressure. That's their purpose. They don't move quickly, they don't respond emotionally, and they don't adjust based on public criticism alone, which means the harder the pressure becomes, the stronger the resistance can get. And that creates a feedback loop. More resistance, more frustration, more escalation, even more resistance. And once that loop starts, it's very difficult to stop. At the same time, something else is happening that makes this situation even more unstable. The external environment is getting worse. The war is no longer a distant headline. It's becoming a defining issue. Costs are rising, not just in terms of money, but in terms of perception, because prolonged conflicts change how leadership is judged. At first, they can create unity, but over time, they create fatigue. Questions start to emerge. What's the objective? What's the timeline? What's the cost? And most importantly, what's the exit? Right now, those answers aren't clear. And when answers aren't clear, narratives fill the gap. Some say the conflict is necessary. Others say it's a mistake. Some frame it as strength. Others frame it as overreach. And those competing narratives are now colliding with everything else that's happening. The economic pressure, the institutional resistance, the political fragmentation, all of it merging into a single volatile situation. Then there's another layer, one that hasn't fully exploded yet but is building quietly in the background, the internal divide. Because while the focus is often on external opposition, what's happening inside the coalition might be even more important. Voices that were once unified are starting to diverge, not dramatically, not in a way that breaks the movement, but enough to create tension, enough to create questions. Some are fully aligned with the current direction. Others are beginning to push back, subtly, cautiously, but noticeably. And in politics, subtle shifts often signal bigger changes coming, because movements don't fracture overnight. They evolve, they adjust, they test boundaries, and right now, those boundaries are being tested. At the same time, There's a growing sense that control over the narrative is slipping. For years, the strategy was simple. Dominate the conversation, set the agenda, move faster than opposition can react. But now the conversation is being shaped by multiple forces at once. Courts issuing rulings, markets reacting to global events, media coverage expanding beyond traditional boundaries, international attention increasing. And when multiple forces are shaping the narrative simultaneously, it becomes much harder to control. That's why the reaction has become more direct, more aggressive, more personal. Because when control over the narrative weakens, the instinct is to reassert it, to push harder, to speak louder, to challenge anything that stands in the way. But here's the critical point. That strategy works best when the system is flexible, when institutions bend, when opposition fragments, when pressure leads to compliance. Right now, that's not what's happening. The system isn't bending, it's holding. Courts are issuing rulings, judges are pushing back, regulators are maintaining independence, and even within the political landscape, alignment isn't as automatic as it once was, which creates a situation that's fundamentally different from what we've seen before. Because this isn't just a political fight, it's a structural one, a test of how far executive power can go, and how strongly the system responds when those limits are challenged. And that's why this moment matters, because it's not just about one decision, or one post, or one reaction. It's about the direction things are moving. Are we heading toward greater confrontation, greater resistance, a deeper divide between power and oversight? Or is there a point where things stabilize, where strategies adjust, where a new balance is found? Right now, that answer isn't clear, but the tension is. And tension, when it reaches a certain level, doesn't stay contained. It spreads into policy, into politics, into public perception, and eventually into outcomes. Because in situations like this, something always changes. The only question is what, and how far it goes. And this is where everything comes together, not as separate events, but as one connected moment that could define what happens next. Because when you step back and look at the full picture, this isn't just about a president reacting to a court ruling. It's about a system under pressure from multiple directions at the same time, and no clear release valve in sight. The courts are pushing back. The economy is showing signs of strain. The war is expanding in uncertainty. The political coalition is no longer perfectly aligned. And the narrative, once tightly controlled, is now being shaped by forces that don't answer to any single authority. That combination is rare, and when it happens, it usually leads to one of two outcomes. Either the system stabilizes or it escalates. Right now, it feels like we're somewhere in between. Because on one hand, the institutions are still holding. The courts are functioning. Judges are issuing rulings. Independent agencies are continuing to operate based on their mandates. There's no collapse, no sudden breakdown. The structure is still intact. But on the other hand, the pressure is increasing. And pressure, when sustained long enough, forces change. Not always immediately, not always visibly, but eventually. And the direction of that change depends on how the next decisions are made. Because the next phase of this story isn't going to be defined by statements or social media posts. It's going to be defined by actions, real decisions, real consequences. Will there be an attempt to bypass the limits that have been set? Will there be a shift in strategy, something more measured, more calculated? Or will the confrontation continue to intensify? That's the uncertainty Washington is dealing with right now. And it's not just a domestic issue anymore, because the global impact is already unfolding. Allies are watching closely, not just to see what policies are implemented, but to understand how stable the system is under pressure, because stability matters. It affects markets, it affects diplomacy, it affects decisions made far beyond U.S. borders. At the same time, adversaries are watching too. not necessarily for weakness, but for signals. Signals about how decisions are made, how quickly reactions happen, how internal conflicts affect external strategy. Because in geopolitics, perception is often just as important as reality. If the perception is that leadership is constrained, challenged, or divided, that perception alone can influence global behavior. Then there's the economic dimension. Markets don't wait for clarity. They react to uncertainty. And right now, uncertainty is growing. Energy prices are volatile. Investment decisions are being delayed. Long-term forecasts are becoming harder to make. And when uncertainty reaches a certain level, it starts to affect confidence, not just in policies, but in direction. Because investors, businesses, and institutions all rely on one thing above everything else: predictability. And when predictability disappears, even temporarily, it changes how decisions are made. That's the environment right now: uncertain, fluid, unresolved. But here's the most important part. Moments like this don't last forever. They lead somewhere. They force resolution, one way or another. Because pressure always finds an outlet. It either reshapes the system, or it reshapes the strategy within it. And that's what makes this moment so critical. Because the next moves, whether they come from the courts, from the administration, from political allies, or from global events, will determine which path this takes: stabilization or escalation, adjustment or confrontation. And the truth is, no one knows for certain which direction it will go. Not analysts, not politicians, not even the people directly involved. Because situations like this evolve in real time. They change based on decisions that haven't been made yet, reactions that haven't happened yet, events that haven't unfolded yet. But one thing is clear: the era of uncontested momentum is over. What comes next will be shaped by resistance, by limits, and by how those limits are handled. And that brings us back to the moment that started all of this, that late night post. Because it wasn't just a reaction, it was a signal that the balance between power and restraint is being tested, a signal that the system is no longer moving in a single direction, and a signal that the next phase of this story will be defined not by what has already happened, but by what happens next. So now the question isn't just about one ruling, one policy, or one decision. It's bigger than that. It's about the future direction of power itself. And in moments like this, the answer is never simple, but it is always consequential. Because whatever happens next won't just shape this presidency, it will shape the system around it. And once that system changes, everything else follows.